This is the podcast of the NOVA Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment. Welcome.
My name is Luís Prata Castro, and I will be conducting this month's interview on forced labor regulation. Today we have here Manuel Leitão Marques, that has a law degree, has also a PhD in economics, has had a very intense political career, starting, for example, as Secretary of State for Administrative Modernization in Portugal, then as Minister of the Presidency and Administration Modernization also in Portugal, and also a member of the Parliament. Currently, she's the member of the European Parliament and has a lot of responsibilities on that EU institution, and is the co-rapporteur of the forced labor regulation. She is also a professor at the University of Coimbra also, and we wanted to welcome you and thank you for joining our podcast. It is a great honor. Today, we will be talking about these topics related to sustainability and ESG matters, as the European Council and the Parliament reached an agreement on the forced labor regulation on 5th May 2024, and with a final text on 13 March 2024. And this proposal was presented on 14 September 2022 by the European Commission to prohibit the placing and making available on the market, including the import and export of products made with forced labor on the EU market. The Commission presented these proposals on the grounds that a large number of people are subject to forced labor, estimated in 27.6 million people in the world, both in private economy and some state entities, according to the International Labour Organization. So I will start with a question, as I think it's important to place ourselves in this topic of the forced labor. Maria Manuel, what constitutes modern slavery and forced labor, and why is it important to talk about it today? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luís. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic. Forced labor is still found in a large number of sectors worldwide, such as textiles, mining, agriculture, and service sectors. As you said before, it is estimated that 27.6 million people are in a situation of forced labor, of whom 3.3 million are children, and that products made with forced labor create illegal profit to a value of $236 billion per year, almost the same of humanitarian aid in the world. Not very, a little bit less, but not very different from the value of humanitarian aid. As in the past, forced labor is all worker or server which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. It refers to situation in which persons are coerced to work either with violence or intimidation, or by more indirect means such as manipulated debt, retention of identity papers, very common, or threats of denunciation to the immigration authorities, also very common in some countries. This is, in fact, a form of modern slavery. And the fact that it still exists today in this world, or we have information in real time about everything, shows that voluntarily guidelines and best practice are not enough. They are important, of course, but not enough. So we need mandatory rules, as they exist in the United States of America, to eradicate this practice from the internal market.
Thank you very much for your great and brief introduction. I think we can now follow on. How does the legislative proposal intend to reach its goal of eradicating products made with forced labor regulation from the EU market? Can you give me some insight? Thank you.
In a nutshell, because there are many legal details in the procedure, this legislation will empower the EU to prohibit and remove a product from the single market if it is shown, if there is evidence that forced labor contaminated the product, that forced labor exists in its supply chain, in any phase of the supply chain. This is regardless the product is produced within the EU or imported. It's the case of the majority of the cases with forced labor. And to detect the forced labor, we will build at European level a database which will be established with help of external expertise and provide authorities with important information for their investigation. Areas or products probably more contaminated with forced labor. If the forced labor takes place outside the European Union, the Commission will lead the investigations. That is the lead authority to the, with collaboration of the Member States authority, but it is the Commission. The responsibility to the investigation is to the Commission. If forced labor takes place within a Member State, the competent authority of that Member State will lead the investigation. To decide where to best allocate resources, authorities must use a risk-based approach to focus first on the larger, more relevant cases because they are more important in terms of business. This proposal is very important from the Parliament, a point we discuss a lot, we fight for very strong. Also includes specific provisions for when the actor imposed forced labor is not a company, but a state, which means state-imposed forced labor. And we have specific rules to facilitate the investigation and decision about these cases, state-imposed forced labor, such as the same happens in the United States related to Xinjiang and Uyghur region. During the investigation, of course, the authorities will be in regular contact with relevant companies and they will be given the opportunity to provide evidence and to show that it's not the case or that they are doing their best in order to eliminate forced labor. Also, in all these processes, very important for us, small and medium companies will be special supported, for example, through one-stop shops with all the information relevant about forced labor and also guidelines for this kind of companies. At the end of the investigation, if a decision to ban forced labor is made by the competent authority, Commission, or the authority from one authority from the member states, the product will be removed from the single market and in principle destroyed. And this will be communicated, of course, to the customs authorities in order to forbid the entrance of other products with the same origin.
I think that the point that you focused on, the state-imposed forced labor, is really important as the cases of Xinjiang are happening. And I think that is really important also. And I was thinking on the question of the small and medium enterprises, as we are moving to another question. We have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that was recently approved, finally. And I wanted to know, is it important to ensure that policy coherence between the various instruments in the European level? How will the proposed regulation prohibiting products made with forced labor interact with the CSDDD? And this question of the SMEs, for example?
Very interesting question. The directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, it is known here in the Parliament, that is an agreement, last minute agreement before Easter, sets obligation for companies. It's focused on companies' behavior to mitigate their negative impact on human rights, on environment, on child labor, on slavery, on labor exploitation, pollution, deforestation, or damage to the ecosystems. These are what we often refer due diligence. obligation in lato sensu. By contrast, the forced labor regulation, it is a very important point during the discussion of this regulation, is focused on products, not in companies. This is why there are no exception for small and medium companies, because our focusing on products, no matter if the product comes from SMEs or a big company. It will ban any product made with forced labor from the single product. But this, of course, will directly motivate companies to make sure their supply chains do not include this practice of forced labor. But it does not create any obligation for them in this regard. Motivate them, because it's better to do that at the end of the day. Imported products made with forced labor that are going to be banned from the internal market. So the two proposals are interlinked, is true. If a company has carried out effective due diligence on its supply chain concerning exploitation of workers through forced labor, it is unlikely that there will be evidence of forced labor in that.
Thank you so much. I think that is really important to highlight how these two legislative pieces work together. And it's really important to understand this broad issue of human rights, because human rights are not one issue. It's you have to have an holistic approach. So that was a great sum up on how they will communicate.
We fight against, on the contrary of due diligence, here there are no exceptions for companies according to their size, in a nutshell for SMEs.
Of course, but it's important that you have provisions for the SMEs.
In order to facilitate the access to the information, guidelines for their behavior, more time to provide evidence that they are not using products made with forced labor, and so on. That is the delays, extended delays, and so on. And everything is in the regulation.
Thank you so much. So moving on, in your opinion, is the proposed regulation in line with international standards, such as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises taken into account in this proposal and this now law? Thank you.
As other problems we discuss in the Parliament more and more, relate to environment, relate to digital world. This is a global problem, and the efforts to combat it need to rely on international cooperation. We are discussing also here now artificial intelligence. Also, we need to deal with the risks at a global level, but with forced labor the same. This is why we took the most care to make sure the forced labor regulation is in line with international standards. There are two aspects related to forced labor. One is to protect workers, but there is another one that is to protect our market from unfair competition. So it's also an important point, also for SMEs. So the regulation has an article dedicated to the international cooperation with authorities of third countries, very important, special third countries where we need to go to investigate forced labor, and also international organizations. Concerning specific provisions, more specific provision of international standards, there are some that unfortunately we, the Parliament, did not manage to include in the regulation during the difficult negotiations with the Council, despite they are a priority for the Parliament. And this was the case, for example, for remediation for victims of forced labor, which is part of OECD and the United Nations guidelines. But member states were strongly opposed to this idea, saying that is not in the scope of this regulation. Nevertheless, it's maximum we achieved. In a future review of this regulation, the Commission will assess the need for a specific tool to remediate forced labor.
I think it's really important to highlight how the legislative process followed on. So I will be moving to other question. What is the position of the European Parliament on this legislative piece as it was finally approved? And certainly it had some changes, and I wanted to understand as co-rapporteur, Manuel, what's your position and how does the Parliament see this piece of legislation?
Thank you very much. Only to add maybe a specific point, remediation means to compensate the workers force that product that are involving the production in the specific product where there is evidence that the product was made with forced labor. The European Parliament stands behind the final agreement reached with the Council. These are the overwhelming support at committee without votes against, and I'm sure, convinced, deeply convinced, the same will be the case at the plenary in the last plenary in Strasbourg in April.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting because that plenary vote will happen on April, and we are near the European Parliament elections. So it was really a rush to finalize all these relevant legislations regarding business human rights, sustainability, reporting on sustainability also. So it's really interesting to see how the landscape is changing.
If I can, it's a first step as with due diligence, more with due diligence because the negotiation was more difficult than with forced labor, but it's a first step, but it's a way we need to do because we cannot tolerate modern slavery in this century. In the center of the information, we have no information about this reality.
Thank you so much, Manuel. It was the utmost pleasure to have you here. We know you're very occupied and a very active political figure on the EU, and we are really thankful for your presence and your great contribution, and also your participation on a piece of legislation that is so important for all of us, business and human rights enthusiasts. Thank you so much.